You are 8 years old, standing in a cathedral that seems to scrape the very heavens. The stone floor beneath your bare feet is so cold it burns, and every breath you draw carries the heavy perfume of incense mixed with the sour tang of fierce sweat from hundreds of nobles watching in silence. Their eyes are hidden in the shadows, but their judgment weighs upon your tiny frame more heavily than the crown soon to be placed on your head. A priest approaches, his voice echoing against the vast stone arches. Your hand trembles as a ring, far too large for a child, slides down over your small knuckle. It dangles loosely, heavy as a shackle. Beside you stands a boy, barely 13, his hands shaking as badly as yours. You do not know him. He is not yet a man, not yet an emperor, yet today he will be both. You are Agnes of France, daughter of Louis VII, King of the Franks. And today, in the year 1180, you become Empress of Byzantium. This is not a wedding born of love or choice. It is the culmination of negotiations made in smoky chambers thousands of miles from here, where men who never thought to ask your opinion wagered your childhood as the price of alliance. Before you have even learned to braid your own hair, you are bound to an empire whose language you do not yet speak, whose rituals you do not yet understand, and whose destiny will soon consume your own. History is filled with stories of kings and generals, of sieges and battles. But hidden beneath the clang of swords and the thunder of hooves are quieter tragedies, the lives of children sacrificed at the altar of politics. Agnes's life is one of them. Married at 8 to a boy emperor who would soon be dead. Then, at 12, forced into marriage with a man old enough to be her grandfather, Andronikos Komnenos, one of Byzantium's most ruthless rulers. Her story is not one of triumph or conquest, but of survival, a testament to the silent endurance of those whose voices history rarely records. Before we dive into this tale of survival, betrayal, and the collapse of an empire, if you enjoy exploring the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. These forgotten stories deserve to be told, and your support helps keep them alive. And please, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I find it remarkable that, across oceans and centuries, we can gather here to breathe life back into the voices of the past. Now let us step back. To understand how an 8-year-old French princess became the Empress of Byzantium, we must first explore the desperate ambitions of her father, King Louis VII of France. Haunted by failure, surrounded by enemies, and desperate for allies, he wagered his daughter's life against the shifting balance of medieval power. Paris in the late 12th century was not the glittering city of lights we imagine today. It was a crowded, smoky, mud-streaked town clinging to the banks of the Seine, where the shadow of Notre Dame's rising towers stretched across streets filled with merchants, beggars, and pilgrims. In the heart of this world stood King Louis VII of France, a ruler haunted by failure and surrounded by rivals. Louis's life had been marked by disappointment. His first marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had ended in disaster. Eleanor, brilliant and ambitious, had grown disillusioned with the gentle, pious king. Their union collapsed, and with Eleanor's remarriage to Henry II of England, France's greatest duchy slipped from Louis's hands. Overnight, the Angevin Empire rose, a colossus stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, threatening to strangle France itself. Louis VII, remembered by many as more monk than monarch, spent his reign attempting to defend his dwindling authority. His campaigns in the Second Crusade had ended in humiliation. His political influence had been eclipsed by the Plantagenet juggernaut. His legacy, if left unchanged, would be one of weakness. But there was still one path to redemption: diplomacy. The Byzantine Empire, once the shining jewel of Christendom, was itself growing desperate. The Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, faced enemies pressing from all sides. To the east, the Seljuk Turks nibbled steadily at Byzantine lands in Anatolia. To the west, Norman adventurers from Sicily threatened the empire's holdings in the Balkans. Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had carved privileges out of the empire's ports, siphoning off wealth that once filled Constantinople's treasuries. Manuel needed allies, and alliances were forged in marriage. The offer came: a union between the imperial family of Byzantium and the Capetian dynasty of France. For Louis, It was an opportunity he could not refuse. An alliance with Constantinople meant recognition, prestige, and perhaps even a counterbalance to the suffocating power of the Plantagenets. For Manuel, it meant Western support and legitimacy at a moment when his empire wavered on the edge of decline. The price of this arrangement was a child. Agnes of France was born in 1171, the daughter of Louis and his third wife, Adele of Champagne. From the moment of her birth, she was not so much a daughter as a bargaining chip. Chroniclers describe her as delicate and fair, with the wide-eyed innocence of a child who still preferred dolls to politics. Yet before she had even learned to walk confidently, her life had already been promised away. The negotiations unfolded in Paris with Byzantine ambassadors arriving in dazzling procession. They carried silks that shimmered like water under torchlight, spices whose perfume overwhelmed entire halls, and manuscripts gilded with gold leaf that seemed to glow in the candlelit air. The Franks marveled at their magnificence, for even in decline the Byzantines projected wealth that dwarfed anything seen in the West. The terms were agreed. Agnes would be betrothed to the emperor's son, Alexios II Komnenos. She was 7 years old when the betrothal ceremony was held in the royal chapel of Paris. The child stood bewildered, dressed in finery that dragged at her small frame, while the ambassadors recited formalities in Greek, words she could not understand, binding her to a boy she had never met. A miniature crown was placed upon her head, its pearls from the Black Sea gleaming under torchlight. It slipped forward, forcing her small neck to bow under its weight. Canon law required her consent, but everyone in the room knew it was a formality. When the question was asked, "Do you consent to this union?" her whispered reply was less an answer than an echo of expectation. At 7, what choice did she have? That year became her last in France. While other girls played in gardens or learned simple household duties, Agnes was trained to become an empress. Greek tutors arrived to teach her the language of her new home, filling the palace corridors with the unfamiliar cadences of Byzantine speech. Seamstresses dressed her in silks modeled on Constantinople's fashions, garments so heavy that they forced her to practice walking with rigid dignity. Priests instructed her in the theology of the Eastern Church, careful to prepare her for a world where Latin rites would be viewed with suspicion. Every aspect of her life was reshaped to serve her future role. Childhood toys gave way to etiquette lessons. Storybooks were replaced by illuminated icons. Agnes was being remade, not for herself, but for an empire. The story begins not in Constantinople, but in Paris. And so, at the age of 8, she was placed in a procession bound eastward. Across mountains and seas she would travel, carried toward a city she could scarcely imagine, a city that called itself the Queen of the World. Her future awaited in Constantinople, but so too did betrayal, sickness, and the schemes of men who saw in her not a child, but a symbol. The journey was long, dangerous, and transformative, and it marked the moment when Agnes of France left behind the life she had known, stepping into the machinery of empire from which there was no return. The year was 1179 when the little princess began her journey. Paris, with its gray skies and muddy streets, was the only home she had ever known. Now, she was lifted into a gilded carriage, her small hands clutching a doll wrapped in scraps of silk, the last token of a childhood rapidly slipping away. Nobles and courtiers lined the courtyard, bowing as though this child were already an empress. For Agnes, it felt less like a triumph and more like an exile. The road eastward wound through Burgundy, over the Rhine, and across the jagged peaks of the Alps. Each night she slept in a different fortress or monastery, and each morning she was dressed again in silks that itched against her skin, a little ambassador of France to lands she could not yet name. Chroniclers record the Byzantine escort that accompanied her, men in robes of purple and gold, their speech flowing in strange cadences that sounded to her like song. At first, she was afraid of them. Over time, she began to mimic their words, giggling at the unfamiliar shapes they made in her mouth, unaware that these sounds would soon become the language of her survival. The journey was long and slow, plagued by storms and illness. The Alps were the worst. Caravans of mules carried her dowry, trunks of jewels, bolts of fine cloth, reliquaries studded with gems, gifts meant to impress the emperor of Byzantium. Snow blinded the party, winds screamed down the passes, and more than one servant perished on the icy cliffs. Yet the child princess was bundled in furs so heavy she could scarcely move, peeking from beneath the hood as if from a prison, her blue eyes staring out at a world turning ever stranger. After months of travel, the entourage descended toward the Adriatic, where the sea stretched out in endless gray and green. Here, in the port of Venice, Agnes caught her first glimpse of the waters that would carry her to her new life. Venetian merchants bustled around her, their language harsh and quick, their ships taller than the towers of Paris. To the child, it was terrifying and wondrous. The voyage across the Mediterranean was a trial all its own. The Byzantine fleet had come to escort her, sleek galleys rowed by men who moved in perfect unison, their oars slapping the water like the beating of a giant's heart. On deck, the smell of salt, tar, and sweat clung to everything. Storms drove the ships apart, waves heaving them like toys, and Agnes clutched her doll in terror as the sea threatened to swallow them whole. Yet there were moments of beauty. Dolphins danced in the ship's wake, and at night the sea seemed to burn with stars, as if the heavens had spilled into the waves. The Byzantines told her these were the eyes of saints watching over her passage. She believed them, for at 8 years old she needed to. Finally, after weeks at sea, the fleet rounded the narrow straits of the Bosporus. And there it was, Constantinople. The city rose before her like a dream. Towers, domes, and walls stretched as far as her eyes could see. The golden dome of Hagia Sophia caught the sunlight, blazing like a second sun. Marble palaces lined the shores, their columns gleaming white against the deep blue of the sea. The harbor of the Golden Horn was crowded with ships from every corner of the world. Norse traders with longships carved like dragons, Arab merchants with lateen sails, Italian galleys heavy with cargo. For a child raised in Paris, it was as though she had entered another universe. Paris had been muddy streets and wooden houses. Constantinople was marble and mosaic, silk and song. Chroniclers say she gasped aloud when she saw it, clutching the railing as if she might fall forward into its splendor. The reception was grand. Trumpets blared from the walls. Banners of purple and gold unfurled in the wind. Priests in jeweled vestments lined the docks, swinging censers heavy with incense until the air shimmered with smoke. Nobles bowed as she disembarked, their faces stern and unreadable. Somewhere beyond those walls, in the labyrinth of the great palace, her young fiancé Alexios waited. Agnes of France, only 8 years old, had arrived in the beating heart of Byzantium. From this moment on, she would no longer be a Capetian princess. She would be a Komnenian bride. And in that transformation, she would discover both the wonder and the horror of the empire that had claimed her. The great palace of Constantinople was less a residence than a city within a city. Corridors stretched for miles, linking courtyards where peacocks strutted and fountains splashed over marble basins. Mosaic floors glittered with scenes of hunts and battles. Columns of porphyry and green Thessalian marble soared overhead, their surfaces polished smooth as glass. For Agnes, it was dazzling and terrifying all at once. She was led through gilded doors, the eyes of courtiers following her every trembling step, as though she were a lamb being guided into the temple for sacrifice. At the center of this glittering labyrinth awaited Alexios II Komnenos. He was 13, dark-haired and pale, his slight frame lost in robes embroidered with eagles. The boy emperor was shy, nervous, and, like Agnes, far too young to rule, let alone to wed. Chroniclers describe him as handsome in a fragile way, with the unsteady grace of someone unprepared for the weight of an empire. When the two children stood side by side, the enormity of the charade was impossible to ignore. The empire's fate balanced upon shoulders scarcely strong enough to bear the weight of a crown. The wedding was staged in Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of Christendom. Its vast dome, suspended as if by miracle, loomed above like the firmament itself. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air. Candles by the thousands flickered against gold mosaics depicting Christ Pantocrator, his solemn eyes gazing down as though in judgment of what was about to unfold. Agnes was dressed in Byzantine finery, a gown of purple silk, encrusted with pearls so heavy that attendants had to support her as she walked. A crown, enormous for her small head, pressed down until her neck ached. Alexios II wore purple, the color reserved for emperors, its weight reminding him that he was not merely a groom, but Caesar and Augustus. The patriarch intoned the liturgy, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Rings were exchanged. Crowns were lowered upon their heads and then ceremonially swapped, a Byzantine tradition symbolizing unity. But the sight was almost comical, two children struggling to hold up crowns larger than their faces. The congregation, however, did not laugh. For them, this was not a wedding of children, but the sanctification of empire. When the priest asked if Agnes consented, her reply was a whisper, nearly lost in the echoing vaults. But it was enough. With those words, she was no longer a child of France. She was Empress of Byzantium. The days that followed blurred into ceremony. Banquets spilled into the courtyards of the palace, tables sagging under roasted peacocks, honeyed pastries, and amphorae of spiced wine. Musicians played lyres and flutes while dancers whirled in silks that shimmered like flames. Nobles from across the empire bowed before the new empress, offering her gifts, bracelets of gold, icons in silver frames, bolts of damask cloth. Each gift was heavy, beautiful, and meaningless to the little girl who still wept quietly at night for the familiar streets of Paris. For Alexios and Agnes, marriage was symbolic rather than physical. Both were too young for conjugal life, and the court knew it. Yet they were expected to appear together as emperor and empress, to sit side by side on thrones of ivory and gold, their small feet dangling above the dais. Ministers whispered instructions into their ears during audiences, guiding every gesture, every word. To the outside world, they were sovereigns. In truth, they were puppets. Behind the pomp, the empire seethed with danger. Manuel I Komnenos, Alexios' father, had died only months before, leaving a vacuum of power that the boy emperor could not possibly fill. His mother, Maria of Antioch, acted as regent, but her Latin heritage made her deeply unpopular in a court that distrusted Westerners. Factions plotted in the shadows. Soldiers grumbled in their barracks. And in the provinces, ambitious men sharpened their swords, waiting for the right moment to strike. Agnes, caught in this storm, had no voice. She wandered palace gardens lined with cypresses, marveling at peacocks strutting across the lawns, or pressed her face against lattice windows to watch the Bosporus sparkle in the sun. But everywhere she went, whispers followed. The French girl. The child bride. The empress who does not even speak Greek. For Alexios, life was no less suffocating. The boy emperor was beset by counselors who manipulated him, soldiers who ignored him, and a court that viewed him as little more than a placeholder. He and Agnes may have shared brief moments of awkward companionship, two children staring out over the sea, two innocents bound together in chains of silk, but they were powerless to shape their fate. Their marriage was not a union of hearts, nor even of bodies. It was a political performance, a desperate attempt to stitch together the fraying fabric of an empire. But beyond the golden halls of Constantinople, a shadow was gathering. And soon, it would fall across both of their lives. For in the provinces of Asia Minor, a man waited, a man of silver hair and burning ambition. His name was Andronikos Komnenos, and he would transform their world into a nightmare. The marriage of Agnes and Alexios II was meant to symbolize unity and strength. In reality, it revealed the empire's weakness more clearly than ever. Two children sat upon the thrones of Byzantium, their small forms swallowed by robes and crowns, while real power shifted behind them in the shadows. Alexios was 13 when he ascended, and though crowned emperor, he was no ruler. His mother, Maria of Antioch, acted as regent. To many Byzantines, this was intolerable. She was Latin, the daughter of a crusader prince, and her reliance on Western advisors only deepened resentment. Greeks muttered that their empire was being sold piece by piece to foreigners, that the purple of Byzantium was being stained by Latin hands. For Agnes, barely 9 years old, the palace was a gilded cage echoing with intrigue. She learned to walk through halls where whispers carried sharper edges than swords. Courtiers bowed before her, but their eyes lingered coldly, dismissively, as if she were nothing more than a pawn imported from the West. Even her mother-in-law was a stranger, more feared than loved, ruling with an authority that seemed brittle in the face of the growing storm. Alexios, gentle and timid, struggled beneath the weight of expectation. Chroniclers describe him as bookish, withdrawn, easily swayed by stronger personalities. He relied heavily on his tutors and ministers, but this only fueled the perception that he was a puppet, a boy in a crown, manipulated by his Latin mother and her circle of advisors. The empire, meanwhile, was fraying. In the east, the Seljuk Turks pressed against Byzantine borders. In the Balkans, rebellious nobles whispered treason. And within Constantinople itself, anger boiled. Riots flared in the marketplaces as commoners railed against taxes and foreign merchants who seemed to grow richer while Greeks grew poorer. It was in this climate of unrest that the name of one man began to spread like wildfire, Andronikos Komnenos. Andronikos was everything Alexios was not. Where the boy emperor was timid, Andronikos was bold. Where Alexios was pale and frail, Andronikos was vigorous even in old age. He was a cousin of Manuel I and had once been exiled for rebellion and scandal, notorious for his charm, his cruelty, and his shameless liaisons with women half his age. 4 years he had wandered in exile, seducing princesses, betraying allies, and plotting his return. Now, with the empire under the rule of a boy and his Latin mother, Andronikos saw his chance. He began by marching through the provinces, gathering support. His rhetoric was fiery, laced with promises to cleanse the empire of corruption and to cast out Latin influence. The common people, weary of Manuel's extravagance and Maria's regency, flocked to him. Nobles, too, sensing the shifting winds, bent their allegiance. By the spring of 1182, Andronikos advanced on Constantinople. The capital erupted. Riots spilled through the streets. The great markets burned. In one of the darkest episodes of Byzantine history, a massacre of Latins swept the city. Venetians, Pisans, Genoese, merchants who had lived in Constantinople for generations, were hunted down, slaughtered in their homes, dragged through the streets. Even monks and nuns of the Latin rite were not spared. Thousands died while imperial authority crumbled. Agnes, now 11, was kept sequestered within the palace, shielded from the horrors beyond its gates, though no wall could block out the screams that rose from the burning city. Perhaps she clutched her French doll, worn now, its silks faded from years of handling, and wondered if she would ever again feel safe. Alexios, barely a teenager, was powerless. He could neither command his armies nor protect his people. Andronikos was at the gates, the mob roared his name, and the empire's loyalty shifted like sand beneath the boy's feet. At last, Andronikos entered the city in triumph. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, scarred from years of exile, but still radiating charisma. To the people, he seemed a savior. To Alexios and Agnes, he was a shadow looming over their fragile thrones. At first, Andronikos cloaked his intentions. He presented himself as protector of the emperor, swearing loyalty to young Alexios while stripping away the power of his rivals. He had Maria of Antioch imprisoned, then executed, leaving the boy emperor motherless. One by one, Alexios' supporters were arrested, blinded, or put to death. Ministers vanished into dungeons. Nobles who opposed Andronikos were dragged through the streets in chains. Agnes watched this purge with silent terror. She had no power, no voice, only the awareness that the empire she had been forced to join was devouring itself. Alexios grew thinner, more haunted, his boyish innocence dissolving into despair. He was emperor in name alone, and he knew it. By the summer of 1183, Andronikos made his final move. He had himself crowned co-emperor beside Alexios. The boy's throne had been halved, his authority extinguished. Agnes sat beside her husband at the ceremony, dressed in finery, her face schooled into calm, but her hands trembling beneath the folds of her gown. She must have known, even then, that the story was nearing its darkest chapter. For the boy emperor, Alexios II, would not live to see 14. The year was 1183. The palace at Constantinople glittered as it always had, fountains spilling water into marble basins, mosaics of saints staring down from vaulted ceilings, silk banners rippling in the sea breeze. But beneath this gilded surface, the empire quaked with fear. Andronikos Komnenos had achieved what once seemed unthinkable. The old wolf had slunk back into the capital, wearing the disguise of loyalty, of protector, of reformer. But now the mask slipped. The boy Emperor Alexios II had been reduced to little more than a prisoner in his own palace. Andronikos ruled in all but name, his hand heavy, his justice swift and cruel. He was merciless with enemies. Ministers who opposed him were not simply removed, they were blinded with red-hot irons, mutilated, flung into the sea. His reign of terror spread through Constantinople like poison through blood. Agnes, scarcely 11 years old, lived in a constant state of dread. She saw fewer courtiers each day, for the palace halls that once bustled with ceremony were now eerily silent, emptied by executions and exile. The eunuchs whispered of dungeons filled with screams, of noblewomen shaved bald and dragged through the hippodrome for daring to resist Andronikos's rule. Even the city's cats seemed to vanish when his shadow fell across the marble floors. Alexios knew he was doomed. The boy who had been crowned Emperor of Byzantium, who had worn purple and received the homage of thousands, was now a trembling child cornered by a predator. Chroniclers write of him weeping at his own coronation, where he had been forced to accept Andronikos as co-emperor, a grim echo of what was to come. By the autumn of that year, Andronikos decided the charade had gone on long enough. To rule unchallenged, he needed Alexios gone. The details of the boy's death remain murky, clouded by rumor and horror. Some said he was strangled with a bowstring in his chambers, his small body left crumpled on the silken sheets where he had once lain beside his child bride. Others claimed he was garroted by two men under Andronikos's orders, his cries muffled by the very hands that had sworn loyalty to him. The only certainty is this: Alexios II Komnenos was dead before his 14th birthday. For Agnes, the moment was shattering. She had been wrenched from France at 8 years old, married to a boy she barely knew but who at least was her own age, a fellow prisoner of circumstance. Now he was gone, murdered before her eyes or whisked away in whispers, leaving her alone in a court of monsters. Andronikos wasted no time. Weeks after Alexios's death, he made his next move, one so brazen, so grotesque, that even seasoned courtiers recoiled. He would marry Agnes. She was 12 years old. He was 60, his hair white, his body scarred, his reputation infamous. He had spent decades seducing noblewomen, abducting princesses, bedding widows, his life a trail of scandal. Now, to cement his claim as emperor, he would take the child widow of Alexios II as his bride. The marriage was announced as a political necessity. Byzantine chroniclers twisted the language of tradition, claiming the union would stabilize the empire and bind together factions still uneasy about Andronikos's bloody coup. But everyone knew the truth. The old usurper desired legitimacy, and more chillingly, he desired Agnes herself. The wedding was held in Constantinople with the same dazzling rituals that had accompanied her first marriage. But the atmosphere was different now, darker, colder. Agnes stood in robes that dwarfed her tiny frame, a crown heavy on her head, her face pale with fear. The courtiers bowed, their expressions carefully blank, hiding revulsion behind ceremony. The priest's prayers echoed through the cathedral as incense curled upward, but the air seemed tainted, heavy with unspoken dread. Andronikos placed the ring upon her finger, his wrinkled hand enveloping her child's. He smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that to Agnes must have felt like the tightening of a snare. No chronicler records her words that day. How could they? She was 12, a pawn without voice, bound by chains forged of politics, blood, and fear. Afterward, the palace rejoiced publicly, though privately it shuddered. Feasts were held. Wine flowed. Musicians played. But behind every toast was silence, behind every laugh, unease. The nobles knew that the empire had fallen into the hands of a tyrant who had murdered a child and wed his widow. The people whispered that Byzantium itself had been cursed. Agnes's new life was one of enforced obedience. She was now empress beside Andronikos, but the title was an empty crown. He ruled with terror, parading her at ceremonies as proof of his legitimacy while keeping her under tight control. She had no friends, no allies, no protector. The boy who might have shared her suffering was gone, strangled by ambition. Andronikos's reign became a nightmare for all of Constantinople. He prowled the city, punishing dissent with unspeakable cruelty. Noblemen were mutilated, women tortured, conspirators impaled in the hippodrome as the crowds watched in horror. Yet amid this orgy of violence, he still found time for his young bride, parading her like a trophy, a grotesque symbol of his triumph. And what of Agnes? The sources fall silent. She vanishes into the shadows of history, her voice drowned beneath the roar of Andronikos's terror. But one can imagine the fear that filled her nights, the prayers whispered to a god who seemed distant, the hope that someday the nightmare would end. It would. But not yet. For Andronikos's cruelty would spark the very rebellion that would drag him from his throne and tear him limb from limb. The crown of Byzantium had been set upon Agnes's head twice, once when she was a child bride to a boy emperor, and now again, when she became the unwilling consort of a man nearly 5 times her age. But what did it mean to be empress in Andronikos's court? Not authority. Not safety. Not honor. For Agnes, it meant survival. From the moment she was wed to Andronikos, her life became a theater performance. In public, she was displayed as proof of legitimacy, the Latin princess who had once been the wife of Alexios II, now bound to the man who had seized his throne. In ceremony after ceremony, she was led through the streets, her child's body draped in silks that shimmered like liquid fire. Trumpets blared. Priests intoned blessings. The crowd bowed. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. They had seen Alexios strangled, and they had seen his widow married off before his body was cold. They knew Andronikos's legitimacy rested on blood. And they pitied the little empress, silent and pale at her husband's side, her eyes cast downward, her lips never moving unless prompted. Andronikos himself was both protector and tormentor. To her face, he could be charming, even indulgent. Chroniclers remark on his ability to win loyalty through words, to tell stories that beguiled and intoxicated. Perhaps he used those same talents on Agnes, spinning tales of past glories as though she were merely another audience for his vanity. But beneath that charm lay cruelty of unimaginable depths. For Andronikos's reign was one of terror. He struck first at the aristocracy. Nobles were stripped of wealth, beaten, blinded, executed in gruesome public spectacles. Families that had ruled provinces for generations were broken overnight. He did not merely remove rivals, he humiliated them. Corpses dangled from city gates, noblewomen were forced to watch their husbands mutilated before being exiled to monasteries. Constantinople, once a jewel of the Mediterranean, became a city of whispers and blood. Even the common people, who had once hailed him as savior, began to turn against him. At first they had cheered his promises to purge corruption and defend the empire from Latin greed. But as the years passed, they saw only cruelty. They saw friends vanish in the night, taxes raised, merchants fleeing, and fear thickening like smoke in every street. Through all of this, Agnes endured. She had no voice in policy, no seat at councils. But she was not invisible. To the empire, she was the image of legitimacy, the thread connecting Manuel's dynasty to the usurper who claimed the purple. To Andronikos, she was both ornament and insurance, a living reminder to any who doubted his right to rule that he had married into the imperial bloodline. And so, she lived her days surrounded by ritual. Each morning, she was dressed by attendants in garments heavy with gold embroidery. Each afternoon, she sat beside Andronikos in audiences, her face composed into the expression she had been trained to wear since girlhood: solemn, submissive, unreadable. At feasts, she raised her cup when ordered, tasted dishes first to prove they were safe, bowed her head when the emperor spoke. But behind those gestures, behind the stillness of her face, was the silent endurance of a child forced into a role too terrible for her years. She was 12. She should have been in a garden in Paris, playing with ribbons, learning to read romances of knights and saints. Instead, she was the consort of a tyrant, her every movement choreographed, her every word monitored, her very body used as a seal of legitimacy for a regime built on fear. Andronikos, for all his brutality, was not a fool. He knew the people hated him. He tried to secure the empire through desperate reforms, slashing privileges of foreign merchants, attempting to restore lands lost to the Turks, stamping out corruption. Some of these measures, on paper, seemed just, but they were poisoned by the manner of their enforcement, cruel, arbitrary, vindictive. Fear cannot build loyalty, and the empire's enemies circled like wolves scenting blood. In 1185, the storm broke. News arrived that a Norman army from Sicily was marching on Byzantine territory. Andronikos scrambled to defend his throne, but his tyranny had hollowed out the empire's strength. Armies deserted. Nobles withheld their support. The people, far from rallying, whispered prayers for the Normans to succeed. That September, while the Normans approached, Constantinople itself exploded. A revolt erupted in the capital, led by Isaac Angelos, a noble who had escaped one of Andronikos's many purges. Crowds stormed the palace. Guards defected. The empress consort, Agnes, now just 13, was caught in a nightmare once again. Andronikos fled, dragging her with him in desperation. Chroniclers describe him disguised as a servant, attempting to escape by boat across the Bosphorus, Agnes hidden at his side. But fate had turned. The mob captured them before they could flee. Agnes was spared, for she was innocent, a child, and still useful as a symbol. But Andronikos was not so lucky. He was dragged back to the capital in chains, jeered at by the very people who once hailed him as savior. For 3 days he was paraded through the streets, tortured, mutilated, and finally torn apart by the mob in one of the most gruesome executions recorded in Byzantine history. And what of Agnes? She lived. Somehow, she survived the bloodshed, the forced marriage, the fall of a tyrant. But her survival was not freedom. She remained in Constantinople, an orphaned pawn in a foreign empire, still draped in silks, still bowed to as empress, yet utterly powerless. Her story did not end with Andronikos's death. In time, she would remarry, this time to Theodore Branas, a Byzantine general closer to her age, who treated her with dignity. With him, she would finally find a measure of peace, living into adulthood as the world around her continued to fracture, as crusaders loomed and the empire stumbled toward its final catastrophe. But the scars of those early years, married at 8 to a boy emperor, widowed at 12, forced to wed a tyrant old enough to be her grandfather, would never fade. The death of Andronikos Komnenos in 1185 was as savage as his reign had been. Torn apart in the hippodrome, the old wolf's body became a warning carved into memory. Terror breeds rebellion, and cruelty devours itself. But when the mob's fury quieted, one figure remained standing in the palace, Agnes, the girl who had been crowned twice, widowed once, and forced into a grotesque marriage before she had even become a woman. What became of her? History, so often merciless, grants us only fragments. After the bloody autumn of 1185, she disappears from the chronicler's gaze for nearly 2 decades. But silence is not absence. Somewhere in Constantinople, Agnes lived on, a living relic of Manuel Komnenos's dynasty and a reminder of a shameful past the court would rather forget. It was only later, as the empire reeled from fresh calamities, that her name reappears. By then, she was no longer the terrified child bride or the pale ornament at Andronikos's side. She had become the wife of Theodore Branas, a man of military skill and respected lineage, who had fought against the Normans, the Bulgarians, and later even the Latins. Unlike her first 2 marriages, this union was not born of coercion or political theater. Chroniclers suggest genuine affection, perhaps even love, bound them together. After years of silence and submission, Agnes at last stepped into a life where she could simply exist as a woman rather than a pawn. Yet the world around her remained unforgiving. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade descended on Constantinople. Crusaders stormed the city in one of the most infamous sacks of the Middle Ages, shattering the empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean. Fire and steel reduced the palaces where Agnes had lived to rubble. The treasures of Hagia Sophia were carried off, holy relics carted westward, icons smashed beneath foreign boots. But Agnes survived again. Some sources suggest she and Theodore Brannas negotiated with the new Latin rulers, carving out a precarious peace in the ruins of Byzantium. Her later years blur into obscurity. We do not know when she died, nor where she was buried. But her life, though little remembered, carries the weight of empires. In her story lies the reflection of an age where women, even princesses, even empresses, were treated as pieces on a board, moved by the hands of kings, generals, and tyrants. She had been a daughter of France, a bride of Byzantium, a widow at 12, a consort of terror, and finally, a wife who perhaps found a measure of happiness. Few lives illustrate so vividly both the fragility and the endurance of the human spirit. And what of the empire she was forced to call home? The Byzantium of Manuel Komnenos, with its glittering palaces and confident armies, had already crumbled by the time Agnes was grown. Andronikos's tyranny shattered trust between ruler and people. His violent death left scars that weakened the empire further, and within 2 decades, Constantinople would fall to crusaders. The purple throne that had once carried boy emperors and child brides alike dissolved into a battlefield prize. Agnes's fate, then, was bound inseparably to Byzantium's. Her childhood was stolen not by chance, but by the ruthless logic of dynastic politics. Her life became a mirror of the empire's decline, dazzling on the surface, riddled with fear beneath, and ultimately broken by forces beyond her control. Yet in remembering her, we also remember those countless others, girls promised in marriage before they understood what marriage meant, women traded like coin in treaties, voices silenced by parchment and crowns. Agnes's story forces us to look past the marble and the mosaics, past the glitter of ceremonies, and see the human cost hidden beneath imperial grandeur. History often celebrates the great rulers, the generals, the tyrants. But sometimes, the truest measure of an age lies in the forgotten lives it consumed. Agnes of France was only a child when she was bound to an emperor, and only 12 when she was forced into the arms of a monster. Yet she endured. She survived the fall of husbands, the collapse of dynasties, the sack of empires. Hers is not the story of triumph, but of endurance, and in endurance there is a kind of victory. As the camera of our imagination pulls away from the crumbling towers of Constantinople, we see her not as a silent pawn, but as a witness. A witness to the rise and fall of emperors. A witness to the cruelty of politics. A witness, above all, to survival against the odds. Agnes's life reminds us that behind every crown lies a cost, and behind every empire, the unheard voices of those who bore its burdens.